story there because the Coalition are holding their media conference in the wake of that decision by the Senate, the vote in the Senate to pass the carbon tax legislation. This is Erica Betts, Greg Hunt and Simon Birmingham.
The Australian Labor Party is simply this: will you respect the verdict of the Australian people if we are granted a mandate to repeal this legislation? I'll now ask Greg Hunt to make a few comments and then Simon Birmingham, and then we'll take questions.
We might just stop over for a sec. The Prime Minister broke her election pledge to the Australian people, and the price of that betrayal will be higher electricity, higher gas and higher grocery costs for Australian families, Australian pensioners and Australian small business owners. All of the time, the carbon tax fails to do its job and it sends emissions up. So the result for Australia is higher electricity prices, higher gas prices, but lower jobs, lower investments, and emissions simply transfer offshore to China. So on this day, Bob Brown says he will be popping champagne corks while Australian pensioners will be preparing for higher electricity prices.
Thanks. Simon.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Greg. There is nothing to celebrate today. There is much to condemn today. There is, of course, the broken promise of the past to condemn today, but more importantly for Australians, there are the outcomes for the future to condemn today. Those outcomes will see all Australians pay more, be they householders, be they small businesses, big businesses or industry. They will all pay more, 10% more in electricity, 9% more in gas. They're just the starting figures, and that, of course, is before we see the competitiveness aspects of this carbon tax take effect and jobs and industry pushed offshore. This tax must be subject to a verdict by the Australian people. We call upon Julia Gillard to give the Australian people that opportunity. Rather than going to Government House and seeking proclamation for this legislation, she should go to Government House and seek an election.
Right, thanks, Simon. We'll take questions on the carbon tax. Who wants to be first?
Given the climate policy has now been legislated, will you desist in your campaign against the tax?
Absolutely not. The Australian people elected 90+% of this Parliament on a promise of no carbon tax. The Australian people are entitled to be heard. We will give them that voice at the next election, and if they give us the privilege of forming the next government of this nation, then we will be repealing the legislation. And the question for Labor is, will they join with us to legislate the mandate that the Australian people will have given us?
I'll just add one thing to that. The next election will be a referendum on the carbon tax. The Prime Minister must commit to respecting that mandate if we are successful in achieving it.
Isn't it a bit rich, David, for you guys to talk about your mandate that you may win at the next election when you didn't respect Kevin Rudd's mandate to introduce an ETS after the 2007 election?
Oh, the carbon pollution reduction scheme was such a bad scheme that the Australian Labor Party itself junked it. So let's not forget the history of this. The Greens didn't want it, and indeed the Australian Labor Party didn't want it, and we understand that Julia Gillard was the architect of junking the carbon pollution reduction scheme. She deliberately leaked that to the Australian people to try to give her credibility when she said there would be no carbon tax. As a result, the Australian people were entitled to believe her promise, a promise which she has now willfully broken.
It was only after your party knifed Malcolm Turnbull and ratted on a deal that he'd done with the Labor Party, wasn't it?
Oh, see, that view of history is incorrect, and I'll have a cup of coffee with you afterwards to correct that in your own mind if that is needed. But let's be quite clear, the coalition changed leaders in order to change policy. The Australian Labor Party changed leaders without actually changing their policy, but telling the Australian people that they had and that there would be no carbon tax. And that is the big difference between the coalition, why it can be trusted, and why the Australian Labor Party can't.
Why isn't Tony Abbott here today? Does that show that you're not serious about repealing the tax?
That assertion by Bill Shorten would have to be one of the most immature forays piece into public discussion that I've heard in recent times. It was the Australian Labor Party combining with the Australian Greens that decided to guillotine this legislation, not once but twice, to bring the vote forward. One now assumes, given their propaganda, deliberately knowing that Tony Abbott would not be in the country, to try to make Tony Abbott wear that is, quite frankly, a ludicrous assertion, because if the coalition would have had its way with a full debate in relation to the carbon tax, Tony Abbott would have been here.
The real reason why the Prime Minister guillotined her own legislation is this. Firstly, she didn't want the Australian people to have a say at the last election. Secondly, she doesn't want the Australian people to have a say at the next election. And thirdly, she didn't want the Australian Parliament to have a say during the course of the legislation. And above all else, she didn't want Kevin Rudd to come into the next sitting of Parliament with the ability to say to his colleagues, I'll just defer the legislation. So it was the Prime Minister who guillotined debate on her own legislation, and there's still been no proper explanation.
All right, two last questions if there are.
Backed Arena, and you also moved an amendment to the bills this morning in the House. Isn't your opposition to the carbon tax wavering?
Our opposition to the carbon taxes is not wavering. We will seek a mandate from the Australian people at the next election to repeal it, lock, stock and barrel, and we call on the Australian Labor Party to honour that mandate if the Australian people give us that privilege.
This morning, the Labor Party refused the opportunity to halve the impact on electricity prices. So the Australian Labor Party has doubled the electricity price rise that would otherwise have happened had the Electricity Supply Association's advice been heeded. That was a betrayal of pensioners, it was a betrayal of farmers, of small business owners, and above all else it was a betrayal of Australian families, and there's still been no reason as to why they refused to reduce the impact on electricity prices when they had the chance.
All right, let me last.
Bob Brown has said that...
Sorry, you've already had one.
The Energy Supply Association says that your call to, or warning to businesses not to buy Ford permits will have exactly the same cost increases. So aren't you being a bit hypocritical?
Actually, that's not correct. Our approach has been very clear. There shouldn't be a carbon tax. The best way to take the pressure off electricity prices is to have no carbon tax. And today, what we did was very simple. We said to the government, you don't have to create a 20% price rise on electricity. The reason they did that was to pad their budget. They knew that, and Australian people will pay the price in terms of a 20% price rise. The government said 10%, now the Electricity Supply Association says 20%. This government has turned its back on the concerns of Australian pensioners and families.
All right, thanks a lot.
Tony Abbott won't...
If I owe somebody a cup of coffee, I'll have one this afternoon with you.
So that was Liberal Senators Eric Abetz, Greg Hunt and Simon Birmingham, and the other senators in the Liberal team there holding their media conference in the wake of the Senate passing the carbon tax bills. Those bills were passed just in the last hour or so. The Liberals' argument is that Labor betrayed voters by saying it would not introduce a carbon tax before the last election. The Liberals are saying the next election will be a referendum on the carbon tax.